My appendix burst at 4 a.m. I remember the sound more than the pain, the hollow thud of my phone slipping from my hand as I dialed again. 17 calls. The screen glowed in the dark like a pulse I couldn't hold on to. When Dad finally replied, it wasn't a call, just a message. Your brother's baby shower is tomorrow. We can't leave now. I stared at it while the pain twisted deeper, sharp and wet, like something inside me had already given up. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and dust. I dragged myself to the door, knocking weakly until a neighbor heard. The ambulance lights painted everything in cold blue flashes. I remember gripping the stretcher, whispering my mother's name like it still meant something. Then the ceiling of the operating room. Bright, blinding, voices overlapping. And then, nothing. Flatline, a long, steady sound that swallowed everything I had left to say. I grew up as the quiet one. The child who didn't demand, didn't argue, didn't disrupt the carefully arranged orbit around my brother. He was the center of everything. First son, first grandson, first to be celebrated for breathing too loudly. I was the afterthought, the one expected to understand. And I did. For years, I learned early that love, in my family, was conditional and conveniently rationed. My achievements were nice, his were extraordinary. My emergencies were bad. Timing, his inconveniences were crises. I stopped asking for much after a while. It made things easier for them. I built a life quietly, a stable job, a small apartment, routines that didn't depend on anyone showing up. I told myself independence was strength, not something forced on me. That I preferred it this way, but there's a difference between choosing solitude and being abandoned. Still, I kept answering their calls. I showed up to birthdays, sent gifts, smiled in photos where I stood slightly out of frame. I played my role so well, they never noticed I was slowly stepping out of their story. And maybe that was my first mistake. Believing invisibility meant safety. The pattern wasn't loud. It never was. It lived in the pauses, those quiet, almost invisible moments where I didn't quite exist. At dinners, my mother would ask about my brother's day before I even finished saying hello. If I spoke, there was a polite nod, a distracted eyes already drifting past me. When the check came, I paid without comment. No one expected me to, but no one stopped me either. Once I mentioned a promotion. My father smiled faintly, then turned to my brother and asked if he'd finalized the baby shower guest list. The room shifted just like that. My words evaporated midair, as if they'd never been spoken. Even the invitations felt like obligations. You'll come, right? My mother would say, not waiting for an answer. I always did. I brought gifts carefully chosen, wrapped neatly. My brother would open them quickly, already moving on to the next box before I could see his reaction. There were glances too, quick, shared looks between them when I spoke too long, or said something slightly out of place. Not cruel, just dismissive, practiced. By the time that night came, the one that ended in sirens and silence, I had already been reduced to a background detail in my own life. I woke to the steady rhythm of a monitor and the dull ache of something stitched back together. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was, just the weight of my body, heavier than it should have been, like it belonged to someone else. The surgeon stood at the foot of the bed, calm, precise. He explained what had happened in measured sentences. Rupture, infection, minutes that mattered. Then he paused, just long enough to shift something in the air. A woman claiming to be your mother tried to discharge you early, he said. Said you were stable enough. We disagreed. I didn't ask why. I already knew. Timing, inconvenience, me. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, the man who paid your bill made it clear no one was to interfere. That was the moment something settled into place. Not anger, not even hurt. Just clarity. I realized I had been negotiating for scraps of concern from people who saw me as optional. And even now, lying there after almost dying, I was still an afterthought to their schedule. So I stopped negotiating. I didn't call them. I didn't text. I didn't explain. For the first time, I chose silence. Not because I was overlooked, but because I was done being available. Recovery gave me something I'd never had before, distance. Not just physical, but mental. For the first time, I could look at my life like a set of accounts that needed balancing. I started with facts, not feelings. My parents were listed as my emergency contacts. That changed first. I replaced their numbers with people who had actually shown up. My neighbor, a colleague, and eventually, the man from the hospital once I confirmed who he was and why he'd stepped in. Then I reviewed everything tied to them. Shared insurance permissions, old authorizations, access to my medical records. I revoked each one quietly, filing the paperwork with the same calm precision I used at work. No calls, no announcements, just signatures and timestamps. Financially, I'd always been separate, but I'd been generous. Gifts, transfers, last-minute help that was never acknowledged. I documented it all, not to confront them, but to understand the pattern. Then I closed it. No more open-ended support. No more unspoken obligations. At work, I accepted a transfer I'd been postponing. Same company. Different city. Better position. The kind of move that didn't require explanations. Only notice. I didn't block their numbers. I let the silence sit there intentional. Because this wasn't about punishing them loudly. It was about removing myself so completely. They'd finally have to notice the absence. I left on a Tuesday morning, before the city fully woke. One suitcase, one sealed envelope on the kitchen counter. Lease terminated. Keys returned, no forwarding address. By noon, my number was ported to a new line. The old one stayed active, but I stopped answering. The first call came that evening. Then another. Then a string of messages that stacked without response. I didn't read them right away. I let them exist, untouched, the way I had been for years. At my new apartment, everything was deliberate. Clean lines, quiet light, no history in the walls. I unpacked slowly, placing each item like it mattered. Because now it did. A week later, HR confirmed my emergency contacts were updated across all systems. My medical portal showed a single authorized name. Mine. No access, no permissions lingering in the background. Their messages shifted over time. From casual to confused. From confused to urgent. There were missed calls at odd hours. Voicemails left half-finished. I listened to one just once. My mother's voice, uncertain, asking if I was okay. I didn't reply. Not out of anger, but because for the first time my silence wasn't empty. It was final. The calls didn't stop. They changed. My father, who rarely reached out first, began leaving brief voicemails that sounded rehearsed, as if he were speaking into a room that no longer echoed back. My brother texted once, then again days later, shorter each time. The confidence in his tone thinned into something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Extended family filled the gaps the way they always had. Aunts called under the guise of concern. Cousins sent messages that circled the question without asking it directly. We heard you moved. Everything okay? News travels quickly when something disrupts the expected order. And at work, no one questioned my decision. My performance spoke for itself, and for the first time, I wasn't splitting my energy between proving my worth and preserving relationships. That quietly erased it. The difference showed. I was clearer, sharper, harder to overlook. What shifted most wasn't them, it was me. For years, my self-worth had been tied to how much I could endure without complaint. Now, it was measured by what I refused to tolerate. That's why this matters, because sometimes the loudest consequence isn't confrontation, it's absence. When someone who was always there finally decides not to be. Time didn't rush to fill the space I left behind. It settled slowly, like dust in a room that no one disturbs anymore. At first, the quiet felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. I kept expecting the old pull, the reflex to respond, to explain, to make things easier for everyone else. But it never came back. Instead, something steadier took its place. I woke up without checking my phone. I made decisions without rehearsing how they would be received. I learned the difference between being needed and being used, and how often I had confused the two. I didn't hate them. That would have meant they still held something over me. What I felt was simpler, cleaner, distance without bitterness, clarity without noise. Maybe one day they'll understand what they lost. Maybe they won't. That part is no longer mine to manage. I built a life where my presence isn't assumed, it's valued. Where silence isn't neglect but peace. And if they ever think back to that night, to the call they didn't answer, I hope they remember this. I didn't disappear. I just finally stopped waiting to be chosen.